don't.
I'll do the introduction. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon. My name's Dan Herman. I'm the publisher of Hermes Press, and we're here to premiere a very important historic book about DC Comics before it was DC Comics. It used to be called National Periodicals. If you grew up, when I grew up, there's a little thing around little circles at National Periodicals Publications. And that was actually started a long time ago before it became DC Comics by an individual named Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson. And we're here to talk about Major Nicholson. And we have a book that we're premiering. And I'm going to show it to you and give you a brief introduction. And then what we're going to do is we're going to show you what this book is about. It's only 2 minutes long, so it shouldn't be too terribly boring. And then we're going to discuss why the Major is important historically and why you should be interested in him, and why you might consider buying this book, which is available and being premiered here. Let me just say that this is a general circulation copy of this book, which means that you can buy it at bookstores or comic book stores. This is the Comic-Con exclusive, which was prepared and created just for this show. And what makes this book different is obviously the cover by Jim Steranko, who is known to all, who wrote the foreword to this book, autographed the plate that's before the introduction page. So it has Jim Steranko's signature, and it's numbered in an edition of only 50. So it's kind of a rare thing to have. And Jim, of course, is not only one of the great artists of the Silver Age, but he's also one of the great historians of comics, writing one of the most definitive Series 2 books on the Golden Age. But enough of that. Now, let me introduce our panel first, and then I'm going to show the video, and I'm going to discuss the video very briefly, and then we'll get on to some questions and discussions. And we're going to open it up for questions after everybody has an opportunity to speak. First of all, let me introduce on my left a person who's not listed, but it's Brian Peck, and he works for Hermes Press and has worked for us for many years. And he's responsible for doing the technical presentation of this video, and he's also a special projects editor at Hermes Press, so he's responsible for what's next. And the most important person here is Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson. And Nicky wrote this book and is responsible for this book and spent almost 10 years putting all of these images together that you'll see, which are basically these comic book stories that were based on pulps written by her grandfather, which turned into comic book stories, which turned into content for these comic books. And sitting to her left is Michael Uslan, who everybody knows, because if you like the Justice League and Batman, and who doesn't, and Superman, and all of the true great DC characters, he's responsible for bringing them to the screen. And I'm sure he's familiar to everyone here. And last but not least is David Armstrong, who was Nicky's partner in crime in putting this book together, and spent probably the 10 years with her assembling all of these images. That being said, let's go to the video. Brian, show us the video. That's obviously the cover of the book, which is taken from a Pulp cover, where Major Nicholson wrote one of the stories. That's also taken from a Pulp cover. That's Major Nicholson when he was younger in his uniform. That's a very famous Weird Tales cover, and it's discussed in the book. And that is New Fun Comics, as you can see, one of the magazines, which is actually a 12 by 18 inches, which features the story. Now, these are other very rare copies of New Fun and all. There's another one. And as you can see, that's from 1935. And this is Barry O'Neill. This is one of the strips that appeared in these magazines, which was done at the art by Barry, by Leo Amelia. And these are in the book, and we'll be discussing these because these were the original comic book stories based on Pulp, written by Major Nicholson. which made up the substance of these comic books. This is Bob Merritt. This is another one of the story continuities that appeared in these comic books, and these are examples. But these have been reconstructed, and this is what it looks like in the book. Now, this is the Blood Pearls. The Blood Pearls is based on a story that, again, Wheeler-Nicholson wrote, which is one of the Pulps. And unfortunately, we had Trina Robbins coming to speak about the woman artist who actually did the art of this, but we'll discuss that artist anyway. This is the story that appeared in another one of the magazines, and actually the woman is actually a relative of Nicky's who was used as a template. And that's discussed in greater detail in the book. And this is very Tyrion the Pirates, Milton and F. And there was another one of the strips that appeared in the magazines / comic books that are featured and discussed in this book. These are covers from the Pulps that the stories appeared in, which were later translated into these comic book stories. And that is a picture of Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson in the, I believe, early 50s, Nicky?
1949.
1949, of course. And that's actually the last picture in the book. And just in case you're interested, the music is by and that's the end of the video. Now, the purpose of this is just to give you a little idea of what the book is like. So our conversation here today will have a little context. Nicky, why don't you tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book and tell us a little bit about the thesis of your book and your grandfather?
Well, I started researching my grandfather's life and creative work about over 20 years ago. And I got interested in the comics through the Pulps. My grandfather wrote pulp adventure stories, and a lot of people think of pulps like the 1950s sort of sleazy paperbacks with women with their tits falling out and that kind of thing, but pulps are actually, the real term for them comes from the paper they were printed on, and they were really popular. They started around 1890, something like that, and they were very, very popular early on, almost like television today. And the newsstands were just completely filled with these pulps. And my grandfather started writing adventure stories for the Pulps in 1924. That's the first one that I could find. And it was, I realized as I began to get into the comics, I was a little afraid of the comics because there's so many people who know so much about comics. And I was sort of hesitant to get involved, but the minute I started really looking at these early comics, I just got so excited because I realized that a lot of people that even know something about these, there are things that I could tell from knowing my grandfather's pulp fiction and his life story that people did not realize were part of these comics. And so my grandfather had an incredible life. Many of you, some of you already know. He had an amazing military history. He started in the military in 1911. He was on the border chasing Panjavia. He was in the Philippines commanding Troop K of the African American Buffalo Soldiers. He was in Siberia in 1917 and on a secret mission to Mongolia in 1917. So he had a pretty amazing military career, and his fiction was based on his own exploits. And then when he was writing for Pulps, making really good money, he and my grandmother were living in France in 1929, and when the Depression hit, pulp writers were paid much less, and his income went way down, and they had to come back to the United States. And for some reason, the middle of the Depression, he thought it would be a really good idea to start a comic book business. Completely unknown business model. And so he started National Allied.
Yes, I left at the Allied.
And he produced the first comics that from National Allied, and they were tabloid size. And then gradually they came down to what we consider regular comic books. And right off the bat, he hired a lot of interesting people. Jerry Siegel sent him some drawings on, I've heard people say it, picture paper or like wallpaper type thing, but very, obviously they didn't have art paper. And it was, Superman was one of the drawings that they sent him. And he thought that these two guys had amazing talent, and he hired them, and they were in the early comics from almost the very beginning. There are lots of other wonderful artists whose names most people don't know, and I think that's one of the things that matters to me about this book is to celebrate some of these tremendous artists that we don't know. And the artwork is, there's not a total look to it. You can really tell the individual artist. And I think that's one of the things that I really love about these early comics.
Well, let me ask
these guys know.
Let me ask Michael a question. Now, historically, in your comics historians or producers, generally in comics history, Major Nicholson gets pretty short shrift. I mean, usually in history, what you see is he was forced into bankruptcy, and the Donenfelds basically acquired his intellectual property, assumed his company, and then came out with Action One and all this right. But why don't you tell the audience, in your opinion, what the Major did that basically started that company rolling, and how it was actually pretty artistically interesting and significant, because the artists that he used, like Craig Flessel and Leo Amelia, carried over to the company after he left. So.
Absolutely, thanks. And I'm going to leave it to you to make any corrections as I go through this.
We're going to correct each other.
So, taking off my movie producing hat, I'm putting on my comic book fanboy, comic book historian hat for a minute. And let me just give you a little background, and then I want to give you a context for all of this in terms of setting it back in the times. When I went to work for DC Comics in 1972, I was still in college and was hired by Saul Harrison, who at that point was vice president of the company. And I was at Indiana University, came back home to New Jersey for summers and got to work at DC. And when I first reported the first day, Saul said to me, your first job here, you were going to clean out the closet. So I figured, okay, I can sort through coats and umbrellas, but no, this was a closet that I can only describe in comparison to the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Was the Covenant in there?
It was completely ramshackle, disorganized, and I lived in the closet for a couple of weeks. And it was there that I found George Reeves' Superman suit, green color. I found a Batman suit. This is where I discovered all of the DC ash cans that were originally made, and found all of the DC corporate records, and then had to put them together in order. So I actually had a chance to read all their 50, 60 cease and desist letters they sent out over the years, threatening to sue everybody.
This is Trina Robbins.
Hi, Trina. Thank you.
And I was lucky enough to read the original corporate papers of National Allied. And I asked Saul Harrison, I said, I'm a comic book history buff. May I take notes on all of this? And he said, absolutely, go ahead and do whatever you like. So I read all of the paperwork, including the the acquisition of the company from the major. I don't have the figure in front of me. It was something like $17,000 or $19,000, and Dad, I had it down to the penny. I had all the figures. I found all the sales figures for the first 20 issues of Action Comics. I learned that Superman #2 was the first comic book to sell 1 million copies, and it had 2 printings. I learned that Superman #1 had more than 1 printing and had 3 printings. I learned all kinds of absolutely fascinating bits of history. Now the context. In 1935, the comic book industry, Major Nicholson was doing this right on the heels of Famous Funnies and Funnies on Parade. This was the birth of the industry. And this was an industry, just like the movie industry, that nobody in society wanted. Nobody wanted. So in the Depression, it was a great opportunity for people looking to be entrepreneurs to build something from the ground up. It also, by the way, was an opportunity for many artists and writers and editors who in the 1930s and 40s were shut out of the book publishing industry in New York, shut out of Madison Avenue and the advertising industry in New York because they were Jewish. And all of a sudden, between the movies and this new comic book business, here was a place that welcomed everybody with open arms. So that's the context of the backdrop. The Major moved into this, and he realized that there was only so many comic strips that could be licensed and put into this new comic book format. And in terms of expense of licensing and availability of talent, of IP, that he was going to develop original content for comic books. And that was pretty daring and resourceful back then. So that
original. He was the first one to do it.
Absolutely the first. What I learned from reading through all of the paperwork and doing my own history over the years, and in the years I worked at DC Comics, I made sure I hung out and went to lunch often with Saul Harrison, who worked on Famous Funnies #1 and was there at the beginning, with Jack Adler, with so many of the old-timers, Julie Schwartz, and whoever I could get first-hand information from, Otto Binder. And I learned, in addition to what I read, that this was akin to a palace putsch, what happened to the Major. It was not the pervasive story, oh, he's just another one of those comic book guys with no business sense, and he lost the company because he couldn't understand finances back in the Depression. And you know what? It's just not so. There was an orchestrated effort by Harry Donenfeld and eventually his partner, Jack Leibowitz, to throw the Major into involuntary bankruptcy and to pile on their printing debt, because remember that Harry Donenfeld was the printer. And the debts were run up and then called. And ultimately, in terms of many maneuvers, and I've been lucky enough to read many of the depositions, and I'll let you talk further about that. This was serious stuff. As has come out, and I'm going to have Nicky talk further about it, just like in the movie industry, organized crime has played a bit of an element in the growth of the comic book industry. Mr. Donenfeld, in particular, had connections to Frank Costello, who at that time was known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. A lot of people knew a lot of people. A lot of people had contacts. A lot of people were paid off. A lot of people had their hands out. And there are a lot of questions about the judges involved. And there's certainly no question about the bankruptcy receiver who was appointed, who had turned out, which was learned way down the road, was a Donenfeld crony and was not an independent, fair-minded guy.
Sounds like a Francis Ford Coppola movie, doesn't it?
I think it very much.
I'm going to take up for Harry.
Which Harry? No, which Harry?
Harry Donenfeld. Because I really like Harry.
Harry Donenfeld Jr.
The grandson.
Yeah, the grandson.
I mean, Harry Sr., grandfather. The more I've read about him, the more I just find him so fascinating. And I'm trying to help his grandson into doing a book about him because he's quite a character. And yes, you know, I I also want to say that I don't want anyone to come away thinking of my grandfather as a victim, because he wasn't a victim. Yeah, this wasn't good, but it's business, and sometimes business is difficult, and sometimes people win, and sometimes people lose. And my grandmother, the last thing he would want is for anybody to think of him as a victim.
Let me interject and working on this, but one of the things you see is that the Major kept his dignity. He always kept his dignity and did not allow this to phase him personally.
Yeah.
And he went on with things. He did not play the victim.
Yeah, unfortunately, some of the stories about him, and David can talk about this, because he interviewed a lot of the guys who worked for my grandfather. And one of the misconceptions is that they were all young people, and that's not true. There was a whole group of older people who were already well established in their careers, but this was the Depression, so it was they were looking for work, and they were glad to get into the comics. Leo O'Malley is an excellent example.
His career started in 1909. So
Yeah,
he had been around for almost 30 years by the time he started working for the Major.
and a lot of these guys came out of the pulps, so he already knew these guys from from working with them in the pulps, illustrators and writers also.
Now, let me shift gears for a second. Since Trina came in, what I found interesting is one of the images that we showed you was from the Blood Girls, which was taken from a Pulp story. And the reason I bring that up is because a woman was the artist of that story, Cecilia Munson.
Yes, and I'm so glad that you're saying that it was Cecilia Munson, because so many people think that it was a man named Comic Munson. And it's like, this drives me crazy because they're thinking, well, how could a woman have done this, And yet, at the same time, if it was Comic Munson, why would he use the name Cecilia? Why would a man in the comics business, which was so male-oriented, use a woman's name? Of course it was Cecilia. Thank you for that.
And other women were involved as well in these very early comic books published by National Ally through the Major. Why don't you tell us a little bit about them? She's not the only woman.
Like McKean that you've written about.
Oh, Edna, was it Edna McKean? Edna
Yes.
McKean, who did that cute little,
Right.
Right, we have a picture in the book. We have a
Yeah,
drawing.
right.
We have a line drawing of her in the book, yes.
And also, Myrna, mine's got blank, she Gamble.
Myrna Gamble, yes, yeah.
She also was in the early comics as well. And in fact, she did comics for the Major throughout the entire period that he had the magazines. I just want to finish my thought about Harry, and I just want to say one of the things that struck me in reading about Harry is you have to remember that he came out of a really difficult situation. He was 15 years old when he had to go to work to support his family, and I lived in New York for many years. And the last place I lived was on the Lower East Side, and I became fascinated with the history of the Lower East Side. And in that period where Harry and Jack Lewitz's family also lived there, that was a really difficult period of time for people. I lived in one of the old tenement houses. Of course, it wasn't a tenement house anymore, but if you could sense the history, and you can imagine people living under very difficult, crowded conditions. And I got the sense about Harry that he made up his mind he was getting out of there and he was going to make it. And you got to say this for him. He's one of the more interesting characters that came out of that period and made an amazing place for themselves. So that's my
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that our ancestors did their damnedest to get out of the Lower East Side, and we, you and I and our contemporaries, went back. And let me tell you, those buildings had not been fixed up or cleaned since our ancestors left them. Do you remember the cockroaches?
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we bought one. No. Let me ask Michael and David both to talk about, and I'm going to use the word, the detective work that has gone into basically bringing this all the way. I mean, this is kind of like an undiscovered story because, you know, the party line was always, he went out of business, he didn't know what he was doing, he had wooden teeth, he was a ne'er-do-well. I mean, this is true. I mean, you know, if you read all the various histories that were written over the years, there's the party line. And when you begin to actually historically look at it, like you researched it, Michael and David was responsible for running around and getting a lot of the material that was photographed and scanned and makes up this book, because something like this doesn't come together in 5 minutes. If you could tell us, both of you, about kind of the detective work that's been done to unearth the real facts of this so that this audience can see what the history of it was, because it's important.
So I started working on the project that became the pages that got reprinted in this book by doing an article on Bert Crispin. And Bert Crispin was an artist who, along with Gardner Fox, started the Sandman in Adventure Comics in number 40.
And did Scorchy Smith.
And oh yeah, he became an assistant to Noel Sickles at Scorchy Smith, and then took over the strip when Sickles left over a financial dispute with the syndicate. So the thing is, I started researching and interviewing as many people as I could, and it was very tough to find some of these people, and some of them were pretty easy to find. Craig Flessel was still living out on Long Island. I interviewed he and Vin Sullivan, and I interviewed Fred Gardner when he came to Comic-Con in, I think, 96 or 97. So I had started a series of interviews. It's interesting to listen. I mean, it's funny when you say the party line. When you listen to these guys talk about their experience with Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, their experiences, and I'm going to put this in context because it's only dawned on me over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, these guys were only in their mid-20s when they were working for Nicholson. So when you listen to what they have to say about it, you think to yourself, well, I remember what I thought about my life at 25, and now I know what I think about my life now, and it's changed dramatically based on circumstances. So you have to listen to what they have to say with a grain of salt. And I find it really fascinating and really good that Nicky has done all the research that she's done to basically, kind of pull out the truth of where it stands, along with the anecdotal history that these guys talked about. Because I did probably 2 or 3 hours worth of interviews, video interviews with each one of them. And so you get from them what was going on in their lives. Of course, the thing that was most important to them is the thing that they talk about, whether it's, Craig Flessel drawing, or Vin Sullivan editing, or drawing the covers of these things. That stuff is more important and made more of an impression on them than their exchanges with Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson. What did I get out of them? Well, Vin Sullivan said he wore spats, and he wore a hat. He basically related what he saw physically. And he said, there were times when there weren't checks around. And Craig Flessel said, I worked in the office because that way I knew I was going to get paid. So you kind of get a feeling for what was going on during the time, but you get an overall feel for what's going on. But you don't really get the truth of the matter, except for when you get someone who's actually sat down and researched it. I found the same thing was true when I did the piece on Crispin, because I found all of his letters that he wrote home to his mother, so I knew exactly what was going on with him. And that's the kind of stuff that you get when you look at the transcripts of the trials, and you get to understand, what was actually going on. So I started putting this artwork together over 20 years ago, and it was because of Crispin, but I started to become fascinated with all the rest of the art that was being put together. So I started scanning the things that I really liked, and I really liked, Tom Hickey. I loved Amelia's stuff, and I realized that he basically left the comic book business almost immediately after Superman came out. He did the covers to Action 2, 3, 4, and 5, not 1, of course. And I think that was the last work that he did for DC Comics before he became the sports cartoonist at the New York Daily News, and he became very famous there. And he's the only person ever to do a sports cartoon that did the front page when the Brooklyn Dodgers won the World Series, which is a very famous cartoon. But these guys all had great history. O'Melia had been around for 30 years. Flessel and Gardner had just started their careers. Both of them had done some pulp work, but hadn't really broken into comics. And the major gave them the opportunity to do that, and it was really a great opportunity. Hickey, had gone to school with 2 other cartoonists, as it turns out, in Forest Hills. And, it was amazing that they all were in the same high school. Those are kind of like little stories you find out about the business. And they all ended up going to the same colleges so that they could learn illustration. And all of them basically really wanted to be illustrators. And a lot of them ended up doing illustration in pulps. And a bunch of them ended up doing comics and then never leaving it. But everyone had aspiration to do something probably greater than comics, so to speak. They didn't really kind of look at that as their end goal. But it's interesting, they created some great stuff. And I'll tell you, go by the booth, take a look at the book inside, and look through the pages. You'll see some really great work in there.
I think one of the things that is really important to me, that motivated me, is over the years that I've been doing this, I've heard over and over again people make disparaging remarks about my grandfather, like he was a dilettante, he didn't know what he was doing, like Michael said. And that's just not true. And all you have to do is begin to look at the work that he did and get a sense of how much work it was. And that's what I really want people to take away, is a respect for what he did and what his vision was.
And not only did he run the business, but he wrote a lot of the stories that were in each of these books. And they had, there were 3 books that got published during his tenure there. More Fun, New Fun, which became More Fun, Adventure, and Detective Comics. And so there was a lot of material that was being put together in those books.
And he was a very good writer. I've read his Pulp stories, and they're terrific.
I want everybody to sum up their thoughts, and then I want to open it up to questions. But let me point something else out before we do that. Is one of the things that I found most interesting about this is that very few people have actually physically seen a copy of New Fun and More Fun, because they're extremely rare, and if you touch the existing copies, they disappear in your hands. And a standard Golden Age comic book is about 8 by 10 inches or something like that. And then they became small. These things are 12 by 15 or 16 inches. They're absolutely, they're actually that large. And I don't think most people realize how really large they are physically, because they don't look at them in the context of them being the first comic books. And I thought that was kind of an interesting point of view of, you can't look at these things in the context of the stuff that came out like Action when it was a lot smaller. So that being said, I always like to take questions, but I'd like everybody to kind of, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 points. First question for Nicky. Nicky, what month and what year did Donenfeld and Leibowitz officially take over?
What month of what year did they complete? I don't know, because there doesn't seem to be any written, it doesn't seem to exist. Like, there's a 600-page document of the bankruptcy proceedings, and I have other legal papers that my grandfather signed that slowly, where they slowly got control of the business. And yet, where's the paperwork for how they got it? Now, Michael has seen Michael and I have guessed that what happened, and this is just what we talk about all the time, and what we guess is that he got bought out by the amount of money that he owed to them for the bankruptcy proceedings. So we're guessing that amount then bought his share of Detective Comics.
But the bankruptcy must have a seal with the closing date.
Yeah, which was September
Of 37?
of 38.
Okay.
September of 38, with the seal. Based on everything that I researched, they actually seized physical control over everything in April of 1938. Does anybody know the significance of June 1938? June 1938 was when the first issue of Action Comics went on sale, introducing Superman. That comic book, Action #1, which we know that the Major had been developing, went on sale April 1938. So while I respect how much you appreciate Harry Donenfeld, there's a little evidence there.
You know, the other thing is, we better talk about Jack Leibowitz as well, because Jack Leibowitz lived to be 101 years old, and was a pretty sharp guy.
Very sharp.
All right, let's take some questions. You have a question?
Yes.
Okay, well, what is it?
Let me add a little bit of information.
Mike, say who you are.
Yeah, questions, come on, introduce yourself, come on.
My name is Mike Kaplan, and
And Mike has helped me with a lot of research.
This is a real historian of comic books.
come up and use this microphone.
Yeah, come up to the mic, come up to the mic.
I don't think your camera's going anywhere.
There you go.
My name is Mike Kaplan, and I'm friends with the Siegel and the Schuster family, and among other things. There's a letter from Jerry Siegel where he talks about, you may remember this, where he talks about going to New York in December of 1937 to talk to the new owners. So clearly they were in charge by then.
But the Major didn't know it.
Well, he doesn't, I don't know what he says about the Major in that letter. I'd have to go back and take a look at it. But, so they, seems to me that they were in control in late 1937, rather than, what I heard you say, April.
April 38.
I think that they, in order to get that out in April 38.
Yeah, they were working towards that for
Sure.
quite some time.
And the receiver was there. He was the go-between while they were assuming control, but we've since found out that the receiver was in their
Right,
pocket.
and Jerry talks about being picked up in a limousine and all kinds of stuff.
Let me.
But they did not serve
In
him with bankruptcy papers.
in the legal business, we call that a conflict of interest. That was kind of a joke.
They did not, he was not served with papers until December 28th or 29th. I can't remember off the top of my head, but this was at the end of December.
Right. It just seems to me that de facto they were in control in the last month or two of 1937.
Yeah.
Whatever the legal papers may be, I think they were running the show by then. I mean,
I think that's probably,
Yeah, I think you're right. As a recovering lawyer, to me it's more important to know what the legal dates are. But yeah, I'm sure you're right in
yeah,
terms of
I agree
day-to-day.
too. I agree.
Well, let's take another question. Thank you very much. Let's take another question. Anybody have any questions? Go ahead, and then we'll get you. Go ahead.
What did the Major do after the sale, and what did he think about the industry after what it became?
Well, the family stories are, he was devastated. He was
Bless you.
absolutely devastated. My grandfather wasn't a heavy drinker. He and my grandmother had a ritual martini every night. That was it. But according to my aunts and my dad and my uncle, afterwards he just went absolutely nuts. My family tends to be a tribal dramatic, and one of the stories is that he threatened to join the Black Watch, which was sort of like the French Farm Legion type of thing.
It's right out of his Pulp story.
Yeah. Just a little drama there. And he normally didn't behave like that. That was not his manner of behaving. So he was very devastated. But after a while, he pulled himself together, which he always did. And I appreciate what Dan said. He always behaved with dignity. And he, because of his background and his education and his interest, he was really aware of what was happening in Europe at the time. And so he started writing nonfiction and focusing on the events in Europe. And he wrote for Harper's and Look, and he also wrote a number of books. And he also continued to write for the Pope's.
You had a question.
You were mentioning how hard it is to find originals of this stuff, and I'm wondering if any of you know if any of this stuff is archived at the Billy Ireland Columbus.
They gave me, they had about 7 of these, and they made copies for me of the ones that they had.
Let me also say that Michigan State University Special Collections, which I'm affiliated with because I use them for my reprints, has material, a lot of material.
They have Craig Fuss's collection.
And and between Ohio State and Michigan State, you have 2 of the really finest collections of this stuff in the world, really. So both of those institutions are very liberal in letting people in. You can't touch anything, but they'll let you in. You can make arrangements to see things. And Randy Scott runs the special collections for Michigan State University.
I mean, the real question is, can you get, reproducible scans at 450 to 600 dpi,
Right.
so that you can actually use it. If they won't allow you to look at the material, then they're certainly not going to scan it for you.
Well, I'm actually asking for selfish reasons because I go out there every year for Cartoons Crossroads Columbus, and I have access to the collection, so I'm going to buy this book.
Yeah,
look at this, and I'm going to go look. I got to see them.
When you go talk to Caitlin and
I know Caitlin.
Tell her that we talked about this, and
Awesome.
they have about 7.
That's awesome.
Let me just say this also. What was really fascinating in designing this book was the fact that we got the material and began looking at it. And normally, we reproduce a pretty broad range of material from newspaper strips like The Phantom and Johnny Hazard and Terry. We did the George Wonder version of Terry and the Pirates. And we do comic book reprints, but the oldest stuff we've done goes back to 1942, which is Animal Comics, which is done from Dell, which is the Walt Kelly stuff. But this is the oldest stuff that we reproduced in terms of comic books. And the quality of it was extremely high, and fortunately, thanks to David, we got very high resolution images which we could use. And the book, I think, reproduces this material very, very well. Now, we didn't alter it, but we restored it kind of like you restore an old film. We didn't change the colors or paint. Well, we brightened everything up because we determined a universal level of what white would be. We had to adjust everything on that basis. But when you look at this book and you look at it, you'll see the art, and I think, and I haven't had an opportunity to compare it to the originals, but I think it very closely resembles what the primitive originals look like when they were done. The only difference being the scale is smaller because obviously we couldn't reproduce it in that scale. Anybody else have any other questions? We have a few more minutes. Do you have a question? So,
yes, I have a copy of New Fun, I think it's number 3, and it says something in it about, you can get these strips for your newspaper. So I guess they were trying, one of the things they were doing was trying to license the strips to newspapers.
That's exactly correct.
Yeah, and they're licensed overseas as well.
And so did those strips appear in different newspapers?
I don't know.
I don't think they ever sold them in the United States. I do know that they did sell some of the stuff overseas.
My grandfather had a newspaper syndicate in 1926 and 27, so he he knew that aspect of the business.
And they were all kind of tied into the McClure syndicate from time to time, some of the guys that were working there.
Yeah.
I do want to add one point. The original editor for New Fun, Lloyd Jacquet, right?
Yes.
This man, know this name. So he's the original editor at what became DC Comics. He leaves there and becomes either the first or one of the first packagers of comic book material. So he would hire writers and artists, and they would create characters, and then he would package them into, at that point, I guess it was 68-page comic books, and with the covers, and then would sell them to publishers. And there, in 1939, there was a new comic book publisher that needed material. He didn't have the staff or anything to create his own stuff. So Lloyd Jacquet and his company, his packaging company, Funnies Inc., supplied them with everything they needed for their first issue of Marvel Comics. Number one, Submariner, Human Torch, that all came through the auspices of Lloyd Jacquet. And I wonder, gee, if he had stayed with the major at what became DC, we could be in a parallel universe today.
We have to wrap it up, but I do want to mention one thing kind of on the heels of your comment. We were looking for photographs of Lloyd Jacquet for the book, and I looked everywhere, and I couldn't find a photograph that I could use. And finally, what do I find but a Christmas photograph of Lloyd Jacquet, Martin Goodman, and Carl Burgos all together, and it was best quality image I could find. So instead of just cutting him out, I figured, well, you know, Carl Burgos created the Human Torch, and we all know who Martin Goodman was. So I ran the whole picture. So there's a picture of all three of those gentlemen in the book during the discussion about Lloyd Jacquet, because that was the only high-resolution photograph that I could find to use. That being said, they're giving me the fingers down. So
what's your booth?
The noose is going to come out and pull my head off.
What's your booth?
Oh, this book is available in a limited edition at booth 1821. If you go to DC and the Legal Comic Book Defense Fund, we're on the other side, and Fantagraphics is right next to us. We're right in the middle of the convention center in the independent publishers area. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed
Yeah,
it.
and I'd like to say there are a whole bunch of people here, including these wonderful people here on this panel, who have been constant support to me. Rika, Mike, Mark, there are a ton of people here who have been absolutely wonderful.
And last but not least, I would like to thank, really seriously thank Nicky for coming, Trina for coming, Michael for coming, and David for coming and putting in so much hard work with Nicky to make this book a reality. And if you could, please give them all a round of applause.
And that they're signing. And that they're signing upstairs after.